Welcome to News Talk with Simoni Vani. You're watching the International News Channel. On 23 June 1985, Air India Flight 182 was en route from Montreal to England with its final destination to Delhi, India. But fate had something else in store. A bomb on board the flight caused it to disintegrate over the Atlantic Ocean at an altitude of 31,000 feet, claiming the lives of 329 people, most of them Canadian citizens and some British and Indian nationals. The largest mass killing in Canadian history was planned and executed by the Babbar Khalsa terror group, made up of Canadian Sikh militants, commonly known as Khalistanis. Their sole agenda is to establish a sovereign nation for Sikhs using land from both India and Pakistan. This year marks the 36th anniversary of the bombing, and joining us to commemorate the tragedy is Susheel Gupta. Mr. Gupta is a senior strategic operations advisor of counterterrorism and national security with the RCMP. When Mr. Gupta was 12 years old, he had to endure what no child ever should have to, the loss of his mother. Mr. Gupta's mother was on board Flight 182 that fateful evening. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Gupta. Can you tell us about what the Canadian government did, or rather what they didn't do, to support the victims of this attack?
Well, this was 36 years ago, and when the tragedy occurred, there wasn't initially a very great Canadian response to it. Our former government at the time, I think, as has been found through the Air India inquiry, treated this as if this were a foreign incident when the conspiracy in this crime occurred in Canada, the criminal act occurred in Canada, and a majority of the individuals who perished in the tragedy were Canadian citizens.
So what do you think the government should have done instead?
Well, I think families would have liked to have seen a collective response from the government in terms of specifically victim support to the families, which means many different things: consular support, trauma support, financial support, and investigative support. But very much so on the victim support side of things. There are a lot of things that happen to a family when they lose a loved one, especially overseas, never mind in Canada, and they require support to heal and move forward with their lives in order to respond to such a tragedy.
So speaking of the investigative support, though, it took Canada 20 years to probe an investigation into the events that led to the bombing. Why do you think there was such a delay?
I think there were challenges. I don't think they were prepared at the time to deal with an immense tragedy and to carry out an investigation with international, with it occurring internationally, not just domestically in Canada. They also didn't have ties with the community in terms of building relationships, informants, people to come forward and build evidence. This was certainly the first significant terrorism tragedy in our country. And I don't think at the time they were prepared for that. Thankfully, I can say that I think they are more prepared today.
Yeah, so speaking of that, in your article with the Toronto Star in 2019, you discussed how the Canadian government failed you and all those who were directly affected by this attack. You said, and I quote, "I am happy that the situation today had improved significantly, and there are a number of good people in the government and agencies working to support victims. There is, however, still work that needs to be done." So can you tell us more about what aspects you think have improved already and what more you think needs to be done?
So certainly I'm seeing more in terms of professionally as well as personally. Coordination between government agencies, both federal, provincial, or more than both, federal, provincial, municipal, more involvement with victim support organizations across the country. We have integrated national security and counterterrorism enforcement teams across the country. And there are initiatives like the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police has established a working group looking to support, focusing on support to victims of terrorism and mass fatality incidents, where best practices are being discussed, operational plans are being discussed, so that we can better prepare our country to respond to another terrorism tragedy or incident, and also to support victims of terrorism and mass fatality incidents. So those discussions are occurring. That pre-planning is occurring right now. So I think that's a significant improvement over the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're aware that there's a memorial erected for the victims of the bombing at Toronto Lakeshore. Do you think having a memorial somewhere in the city is enough to spread awareness of the incident?
Well, there's actually, I'll highlight, there are actually 4 memorials in the country, in Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, as well as a memorial in Ireland. And I don't know if I can say that they're enough, but I think they're important to remind us that extremism, that hate is still part of our society, both in Canada as well as around the world. And we've seen tragic events in Ontario in the last 2 weeks inspired by hate. So I think that is important to remind us that first we have to remember those victims, those innocent lives lost. Second, I think we have to be vigilant to ensure that we don't forget, so that mistakes of the past, tragedies of the past, don't become tragedies of the future, and that we actually learn from it. And I think memorials are one aspect to do that, to accomplish that.
Every year, the families of the deceased hold services to commemorate the victims of these attacks. So can you tell us why these services are so important?
Well, I think with anyone who's sadly lost someone that they've loved, the families get together because I'm going to say we didn't experience a loss or a death on our own as individuals. It was collective grief. And so we gather to grieve together collectively. We also gather to remind Canadians of this tragedy, to foster some sort of resiliency in our communities, and regardless of how you define communities. June 23rd is also the National Day of Remembrance to all victims of terrorism, so we take a moment to reflect upon them as well. And we hope that the message of vigilance, of caution, of being prepared stays with us and moves forward. It's in some way not just personal, but in some way it's a way for us to protect the future, be it my children or other children.
So how did this attack, after all these years, impact your life and the work that you're doing today?
Well, I was a 12-year-old little boy when I lost my mom in this tragedy, and a number of other family friends. And it certainly had a huge impact in guiding me in my life forward. Professionally, it led me down a path to wanting to become a lawyer, working with, formerly I was with the Department of Justice and then the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, and currently now with the RCMP, where I specifically work on matters involving counterterrorism and national security. So it certainly has had a huge impact for me, and I've seen an impact on many other families. But for me, the work that I chose is a way to honor my mom, to provide a legacy in improving things, but not just in the past, but also, as I say, looking forward into the future to protect all Canadians, because I would never want any other Canadian family or family around the world to ever have to suffer as we did. And so I'm able to do that as a victims of terrorism advocate, but as well as professionally and substantially in the criminal justice sphere, working on these issues to combat these terrible crimes of hate and extremism.
So it's safe to say that the incident shaped you to be who you are today, right?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. Others may have chosen different paths or so on, but we certainly all do find ways to advocate on behalf of other victims of terrorism. That is the best legacy I think we could leave to or give to our loved ones that we lost.
No, I absolutely agree. And speaking of others, so how are you supporting the other victims?
Well, I certainly speak with many. So we provide that moral support, that grieving support to each other, because we've all identified with this tragedy. As I say, we lost loved ones collectively. Personally as well, I'm involved in my volunteer life with the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime. So we support victims across the country. I'm pleased and honored to say that I also perform and carry out international functions, both specifically in my personal life, advocating on behalf of international victims of terrorism in countries around the world. And then, of course, professionally, as we've talked about, I get to do some of that work as well. And so working with victims is also a big part of my work because I have that experience of what I've gone through over the last 36 years and the experiences I've learned from other victims. And so that in a way is how I would say we support each other.
And speaking of the professional side, would you be able to speak a bit about what you're doing today to fight terrorism?
All I can say is that I do work with I left behind my legal career just a few years ago to dedicate myself to work with the RCMP on counterterrorism and national security. And that's, I work side by side with investigators. I work side by side with victim support workers, with police officers, and government officials, there again to protect our nation against terrorism. And I have an opportunity to support those investigations tragically when they do happen, with the skill set, knowledge, and experience that I have.
So given the fact that this is one of the worst terrorist attacks in Canadian history, it is not very commonly discussed among politicians, media, and it's also not very widely well known amongst Canadians. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think most importantly is it has been 36 years, to be candid. And, I work with investigators, for example, who are in their late 20s or early 30s, so they weren't even born when this tragedy occurred. So time, unfortunately, erases memory of people. I think as well, and turning back to the inquiry, so there was an inquiry that was held in Canada from 2006 to 2010, and for a multitude of reasons, the government didn't give it the attention that I would say it deserved. But I think lessons have been learned from that, and this is becoming more and more part of the memory. I can say with the professionals that I work with in the law and security community, they are certainly aware of this tragedy, and they take it to heart in terms of the work that they do carrying forward.
So if you could tell people about this tragedy, what would you want Canadians to know?
I would remind them that terrorism is something that isn't just an action that occurs elsewhere in the world. I think we need to be reminded that terrorism happens in Canada, that there are extremists in Canada, and that we should never forget. There were 329 innocent lives lost in the Ernie tragedy, plus 2 innocent individuals who died when the second bomb blew up at Tokyo's Narita airport. So 331 mostly Canadian citizens that were killed in this tragedy, and we shouldn't forget them. That's what I would want Canadians to know, and to know that there are a number of people working to protect our country, and that I think we all need to remain vigilant going forward.
And how do you think that the Canadian government can support the victims of this terrorist attack today?
Well, I can tell you that last year, for example, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police passed a resolution calling upon the government to create a national center to support victims of terrorism and mass fatality incidents. And that center, I would hope, would coordinate resources between federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdictions to provide support needed to families, pre-plan, practice those plans, so that when a tragedy occurs, we are prepared as a nation to respond, to support, to assist. So that's something that I would certainly like to see going forward. And I know that there are government departments working on that recommendation. I'm proud to say, and happy to hear. So that would be key, is remembering that it has occurred. It's not somewhere else, and ensuring as well, being a voice as well for victims, being a voice to ensure that our elected official and policymakers and our governments are preparing to support us when we are all in need. Because I think, no one expects to wake up one day and have a tragedy like this occur to them. It could occur to anyone, and but we do. So we can't plan for that. But what we can plan for is that we have the response mechanisms and the resources available to support in that time of need.
I hear you, and I completely agree. And I want to thank you for taking out the time to speak to me today, Susheel. And I'm really, really sorry for your loss.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
As Susheel just mentioned, June 23rd is recognized by the Canadian government as the National Day of Remembrance to all victims of terrorism. Let's take a moment on that day to reflect and remember those who have been affected by terrorism. Here are a few clips from the 2018 Air India bombing memorial service.
People, you will hear, time heals wounds. But it doesn't apply to tragedies like this.
I think it's important that we remember and grieve with those who are still suffering, the families that are left behind, friends, the members of the community. But I think it's also important that it be an opportunity for us to commit ourselves to making sure this kind of terrorist act that did get planned and executed largely here in Canada, that we never let this kind of thing happen again, and the thinking that lies behind it, that we make sure that kind of thinking has no place in our country, because it doesn't. It has no place in our way of life. It has no place anywhere in the world, but especially here in Canada. So I think that's going to require us to have events like this every year so that we remember, but also so that we make sure going forward that we make sure this is not acceptable in any way, shape or form, even thinking about it, talking about it or doing it. And that's why I'm here on behalf of all the people of Toronto who I know share that view.
And yes, it's true. Love reigns over all. Those wonderful words which are here and those wonderful words which were at the memorial in Cork. But it's also important that we remember that sometimes you have to fight to make love triumph.
Well, it's a solemn occasion, of course. Every year when the Air India bombing is remembered, it's very sad to know that all of these names on the wall here that we commemorate, we share the pain for their families that have lost them, and all those families that are still seeking justice. And I sympathize with them, and I think that their desire to seek justice is fair, and we should still work towards that. But what we've lost is it's just horrendous. The incident was horrendous. That's all I can say. And it's one of the worst incidences in Canada's history. And I think all Canadians feel sad when we think about this event.
You are watching the International News Channel. I am Simoni Vani. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notifications to stay up to date on our latest videos.